Okay, so I'll get started now. I think there might be a few more people join us, but as they join in, they can join in to where we're up to. I will be recording this afternoon's session, so just be aware if your mic's on or if we're getting lots of feedback. It's great to see you all again. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon for this professional learning. This workshop really follows on from that first online workshop that ALEA I presented on strategies for effective literacy teaching on this book. However, if you've ended up in this workshop and you didn't complete the first workshop, I'll introduce myself. I'm Libby Baker. I'm a teacher in the ACT. I ran around 10 of the first workshop in this series from the beginning of the year until about August. But on top of that, I'm also a classroom teacher in the ACT. My current position is as a teach librarian. I've worked as an ELAD specialist. I've worked as a literacy consultant around the state. I've written for ALEA publications, and I'm currently studying a research master's. So I'm a bit of a nerd burger, and I love talking literacy, as most of you would have picked up from the first workshop. Please let me know if you didn't attend that first workshop, and also if you have questions around some of the strategies as we go through. I will be referring to some of those strategies from the first workshop as well. So if you need me to fill in the gaps at any point, please feel free to ask a question. If you hadn't completed that first workshop and you want to, it will be offered at the beginning of 2020. But places will be really limited for this, so keep an eye out for those if you do want to attend, or if you know any new educators that you think would really benefit from this PL. So before we get started, I always love getting to know all of you and where you are. Take a moment or two to introduce yourselves. Feel free to use the microphone or the chat. Let us know what your name is, where you are in Australia, I mean, what year you're teaching, what age group, and you can let us know as well if you didn't attend that first workshop as you introduce yourselves as well. We're a lovely intimate group this afternoon, so hopefully we'll have lots of discussion and collaboration between us. So feel free to take a moment now to introduce yourselves. So where you are, what year you're teaching, if you attended that first workshop. Hi, Larissa. So you're a first year primary school teacher, is PSG, I'm assuming, in WA? What year are you teaching, Larissa? Pre-service teacher, okay, excellent, thank you. So you're in your first year of uni as well. Wow, that's awesome to come along. Hopefully you get lots out of this afternoon. Did you do the first workshop, Larissa, as well? Hi, Brittany. Brittany's teaching year 3 in Tassie. And oh, sorry, your third year teacher in Tassie, teaching year 5. Oh, I love year 5. That's awesome. Wow, 4, 5 and 6. Is that a very big school, Linda, in California Gully? Awesome. So it seems like everyone so far has attended the first workshop, which makes things, oh, nice. Oh, that's so nice that you're back as well. Oh, wow, 140 students. How beautiful. What an excellent environment to be in. I'm a big fan of tiny schools. Okay, so Teresa's in special education and you attended the first workshop. Brilliant. And Teresa, you have a range of year groups, I'm assuming, as well in your class. Second year teacher, Beck, is teaching 3-4. So we've got some 3-4. Year 4, we've got special ed, and we've got year 5. This is interesting. Oh, and Teresa's 2 and 3, okay. in the last workshop, so this is the second one of the second workshop, there were a lot of very junior teachers. So we had preschool, kinder, year 1, and now it's looking more like we're kind of in that middle upper primary school area, which is quite cool. Okay, if you haven't introduced yourself and you want to, you're welcome to do that as I begin. So this workshop came from the overwhelming response that we had from the first online workshop when we wrote, does anyone want another workshop? A lot of people said yes. So that's what this will be. It'll be another workshop looking at some different strategies from the book. Again, it'll be really useful for you to have the book with you, so you can write your notes in it and you can post-it parts. So if you don't have it, go and grab it, or grab some paper or a pen, and I'll give you a minute to do that. Grab your cup of tea if you haven't got to do that yet. But here we go with workshop 2. Let's hope the sequel is as good as the first. There's such pressure with a sequel, isn't there? Okay, so during this session, I'll be going over the following strategies. These strategies are complementary to those covered in the first workshop, so I may refer to that first set of strategies as we go through. To begin, we'll explore some strategies that directly link to those that I covered in the first workshop. So I'll explain how these strategies can link in with the others, and they can actually add some depth to your literacy teaching. Following this, I will go over some strategies that are presented in the book that I would say kind of alternate ways to teaching similar skills. And finally, I'll look at a few additional strategies that are a lot of fun and can really enhance your teaching. There will be some time for questions as well at the end of our session. Like the first workshop, for each strategy, I'll briefly explain the strategy, I'll give you some examples, how I've used it in my teaching, and there'll be time for you to practice and develop your knowledge of the strategy using activities and also lots of discussion today. I'm happy for you to use the mic, or just as happy for you to engage in the chat. What I really hope is that you find this time as a time where you can be collaborative, that you can be reflective on your own practice, and you can learn from myself, but also from the other people who are here this afternoon. So the first few strategies that we'll look at are complementary to those covered in the first workshop. These will assist you to go deeper with that original set of strategies and get more out of them. So let's start off with our first strategy, author study. Throughout the first series of strategies, and sorry, this one's explained on page 7, it's actually the first strategy of the book. So throughout the first series of strategies, you might have noticed that a lot of them, and a lot of the strategies in the book, in fact, rely on you having quality text in your classroom. Read aloud, guided reading, reading conferences. So it makes sense that one strategy that can assist you to have these quality texts in your classroom is an author study. This strategy can be something that is ongoing in your class, so you don't need particularly allocated time for it. It can be something that actually is woven through all the literacy activities that you have in your classroom. As you might remember, the light in this room will turn off for me and make me do some interesting interpretive dancing as we go. So what you do need for author study is maybe a few minutes here or there, just to mention the parts of it, maybe to introduce the author, to make it known. But what an author study can do is it can open up your students' eyes to potential reading material for themselves. I remember discovering Morris Gleitzman when I was in primary school from my teacher doing an author study on him. Stephen Lane, actually, at a recent PD I attended where he was the speaker, mentioned that good readers or literate people know who their favourite authors are. They walk into bookstores and they ask, they go to their favourite authors section, or when they're talking about the books they're reading, they're talking about their favourite authors. So good readers don't know what colour level they're on or what number reading level they're on. They know the authors they enjoy. So what we need to do as we want to develop our students into literate people, we need to be mindful to develop this. We need to not only introduce books to our students, but we also need to introduce them to a range of authors. And this is the challenging part, from a range of genres. And that is really a huge key in creating literate learners. By thinking about a range of genres as well, you're not going to choose authors that are the ones that you particularly enjoy. You need to choose a range of authors. So those might be some authors that you find challenging to read their material, but say some of your students enjoy. Also, this strategy develops students' skills in reading and writing. There is a reading strategy called Read Like an Author. If you haven't heard of it already, this strategy is where you have students trying to kind of get into an author's head, thinking about, why did an author write that? How is it different to the other books that this author has written? And all those choices that the author has made in piecing this story together. In the same way, there's a writing strategy where you think about writing like an author. Writing skills can really be learnt from an author's writing style, their approach to writing even. You can look at the way an author structures a text and even try to get students to emulate that. And one text that I like to use with my students when we're looking at narrative is I love to talk about Roald Dahl and the way that he introduces settings in his books. And I love to read this part. It's not actually the very beginning of the book, it's chapter 2 of Fantastic Mr. Fox, where Roald Dahl writes, "On a hill above the valley there was a wood. In the wood there was a huge tree. Under the tree there was a hole. In the hole lived Mr. Fox and Mrs. Fox and their 4 small foxes." And I love the way that Roald Dahl introduces the setting in that way. He almost zooms in. It's as if we're getting a bird's eye view of where the foxes live, and we're going closer and closer into where the actual place of the foxes live. So he's giving us this beautiful way of introducing a setting. And what I do with students is then that is the key to, how can we emulate the way that Roald Dahl writes in our own writing? And you get these beautiful settings that come out of it as students copy the similar style of introducing a setting by saying, in a city there was a house, in that house there was a bedroom, in that bedroom there was a chair, and under that chair lived a mouse, or however they like to do that. So emulating an author's style is a great strategy for writing. So the steps here are to firstly choose an author that you love. Like with choosing your read alouds, I encourage teachers to find the authors they love or that they loved as students and to share those with their classes. But also here, think about what I said before. When we're thinking about genre, we want to have a range here. So I often actually plan out my author studies in advance. I might have an author study for a week at a time, or I might have that author study go over 3 weeks. It really depends on your class. Sometimes with the older year groups, I find that having a longer author study can be beneficial because it can mean we can read more of the text of the author. And with those younger year groups, it is easier to read, a range of an author's text in a week. But with the older year groups, you probably want more than a week. But up to you and what your week looks like as well. So choose books based on the student's interests. If you're thinking about fantasy, you might put in Emily Rodda. You might think about some comedy authors and have Andy Griffiths. Or look at some of those books that your students enjoy, and you can almost do an investigation to compile a list of their favourite books and the authors of their favourite books, and then that could be your way into author studies. With younger classes, often when I read Mutt Dog to them, one of my favourite books, we're looking at the images on Mutt Dog, and the students notice that actually the pictures are very similar to another book that we read, and then we can start investigating. Oh, well, that must be because the author's the same. It's Stephen Michael King. Let's go have a look for some other books by Stephen Michael King. So you can almost have this organic author study that comes out of a read aloud that you do that students are particularly interested in, or even their own reading in class. If you're having trouble choosing an author, I'd suggest just Googling Australian authors, because a beautiful list will come up, or look at the Children's Book Council of Australia again and notice some of those authors that are award-winning, or look at Reading Australia. They have a search function where you can search through the authors as well, or even better, talk to a librarian that you know. The second step here is that you need to collect as many of those books by that author as you can. Get your greasy mitts on them. It's so important to make these books available for your students to read. I know that some teachers like to keep books away and kind of reveal them to students as they're read. I'm very much of the approach that I think that these books need to be out in the classroom and available to your students from the get-go of an author study. And I know that this is a challenge across the board, depending on where you're teaching as well. I have a friend who's teaching in New South Wales. She's in quite a new school, and this school doesn't even have a library yet, let alone a librarian. So we were talking through ways for her to get her students access to books, and I made the case of actually the state library can be a great way of getting these books. Now, she doesn't have a state library where she is, but lots of state libraries now have online collections in which you can access their whole collection online through login. So that's another alternative way of at least getting that author's books, maybe not into the physical hands of those students, but at least into their space. Now, there's such freedom in this strategy, how you read that author's book. So it might be that you read them really methodically, you know, one at a time, and you're going to read the whole thing, or you might just sample a part of them each week. So, for example, when I used Graham Base and I was in Year 4-5, we read the whole book, and we read maybe 2 or 3 of Graham Base's books for our author study. And his books were kind of the thing that we used for shared reading, for read alouds. When I was talking about writing structures, we were using his work as the example of writing structures. We were using it for spelling lessons, looking at grammar. So it was our text. It was the way that I structured all that literacy around those texts and those author studies. Similarly, when I used Jackie French, though, Jackie French writes quite long books, so I couldn't read the entire book with my students in 2 or 3 weeks. So what I did there was I used a sample. So we perhaps took the first chapter or the third chapter of some of her books, just to give the students a taste of this author and their writing style. For some authors as well, we might have a book that we're reading, say during that read aloud time, but then have other parts of their other books that we use for other literacy activities. So when we're looking at spelling, we might use a different selection of text. The third step here is that it's a great idea to discover more about the author. So you want the students to remember the author's name. So we have to make these authors memorable for the students. There's no point in running these fabulous author studies, having lots of their texts, and then at the end of the week sitting down and being like, okay, so, you know, what did you think about Mem Fox's books? And the kids being like, who's Mem Fox? What? So we need to make this person memorable. So that could be through research, looking at the author's history and how they created each book, which is a great way to make authors memorable. I use the story of Stephen Michael King and Mutt Dog. When I'm reading that book, I talk about how Stephen Michael King actually wrote this book about his dog. So they had a dog that they rescued, and it was really mucky, and it was a bit of a terrier looking dog, and I showed them a picture of this dog, and I say, you know, this was Stephen Michael King. So he actually wrote this book about his own dog and his own journey to get that dog. So, you know, by giving students this little story about the text or about the author, that can be a really great way in. You can often find out more about authors on their publishers' websites as well, or their own websites. I love doing interviews with authors, but it's very hard to actually get a lot of authors to come in for interviews. So sometimes doing a mock interview where you dress up as the author, or you get another teacher to dress up as an author, can be a really fun way of getting students to engage in who that author is, and also for students to think about what the author's process was. So I get the students to write down some questions they'll ask the author when they come in, and I've done one with Roald Dahl, which was hilarious because all the students are telling me throughout the day, oh no, he died years ago, there's no way he's coming in. I was like, no, he's our guest, he'll be in at 2 o'clock, just you wait and see. No, he can't come in. And then lo and behold, one of my teaching co-workers, I got him to put a hat on and some glasses and like walk with a cane and come into the room, and we all went, oh my goodness, it's Roald Dahl. And he sat down and answered the kids' questions, and it was hilarious, but also a really engaging opportunity for the students, and you know, a great way to remember that author forever. The fourth step here is to compile some information about the author. So we've made the author memorable for the students, but we need a way to kind of keep that knowledge in our room and also in our students' heads. So I like to complete like just a summary sheet at the end of an author study where we'd write about who the author was, some of their books, their writing style, what we enjoyed as a class about their writing, maybe what we didn't enjoy as well. Or you'd like it if, or you wouldn't like it if, you know, one of those kind of book recommendation things. And we display these in the class for the students to continue to refer to throughout the year. So as they're then going to choose their text, they can go, oh, that's right. I really like Morris Gleitzman's books. But you can also do things like book reviews on some of their texts. You could have these as mini movies. You could get students to recreate the book or part of the story in any mode, during drawing, digital acting, photo story, or even it might just be a reading response that they put in their reading response journal to share their thinking about the author. I'm going to show you an example of what I would do for an author study now. So I'm going to show you this video. It's on a fantastic website. It's ABC Splash Author Interviews. There are a number of author interviews on this site. A lot of them are kind of for upper school or middle school, and so some are for senior. There are, I think there's a Lee Hobbs one there, so that would be great for junior, or even 3, 4, 5, 6. I've chosen Gary Crew as my author. The book that he's talking about is actually a book that was written for senior school students, but you could take parts of this if you're going to use Gary Crew in younger years as well. I think it's a really great way for us to see inside an author's head, these interviews. And I want you to think, which is what I do with the students as well, about what Gary Crew talks about, how he talks about his writing. What does that teach us about writing or the writing process? So I'm just going to move over to these videos. And I might just make sure. Sorry, I'm just going to give you the link as well here in the chat. If you want to go and look at this as well. He's talking about his book, Strange Objects, and the process he went through to write this. So as he's talking, I'm going to get you to respond afterwards, what it teaches us about the writing process, or why this might be important for students to hear an author say. And let me just check actually that you can hear my sound. There we go. Okay.
And then that becomes my world. And the thing I find is that I just like a wall around me, and writing does that. So the time just is gone. I'll start work if I'm working on a novel and it's a weekend or something, 8 o'clock in the morning. And then I'll know it's coffee time, you know, by midday. So the 4 hours would just vanish, and that's what I really like.
I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that even in 2015, you still write a lot of your drafts with a pen, in fact, a fountain pen.
True.
Why do you still do that? I
truly do believe, and I teach my students this, and all my students die, they have a heart attack. So at the moment I'm working on a novel called, a subject called Writing Your Novel. It's all these young, fresh, young things came in. I gave each one of them a journal, and I bought down the road at the local, trading post.
Yeah.
I gave each one of them a 2B pencil and an eraser. I said, this is what we're writing on this semester. And they all went, literally, there's a generation that actually can't handwrite. They actually can't write by hand. But I believe that I've got several computers. If I'm travel or whatever, I use different one. Of course I do. It's fabulous, great thing. But I believe there is a connection between, like, the brain going down the arm and through the hand and through the pencil or through the pen, which is more intimate contact with the page than your fingers on a keyboard looking at a grey screen. I don't get turned on by looking at a touch screen. It doesn't excite me at all. I do get turned on by looking at lined paper and thinking I can fill that with my personal human marks. And I think it's kind of like the cave person in me who wants to make smudges on walls.
I'm just going to pause it there. He does go on about his writing process a little bit. Did anything strike you about that as we were listening to Gary Crew talk about his writing process that might strike a chord for you about the writing process of your students as well? Feel free to use the mic as well if you'd like. Yeah, I think that always strikes me as well. Yeah, that there is this connection between the pen and the paper that is really important for students to have this physical ability to write, that it's more than just words sometimes. It's actually the physical act of writing. Yeah, that writing helps them to process their thoughts. There should be some kind of train of thought. Yeah, and that your brain works differently with pen and paper. Yeah, and it's so true, isn't it? You know what, there is someone in the last workshop actually mentioned that they'd done psychology maybe, and they said that there is actual difference in the way that we write if we're using a computer or digitally than if we're writing with pen and paper. And that physical process is actually so important for the writing process as well. I also find it very eye-opening about this writer, and you might as well, that Gary Crew, and give him a quick Google if you don't know much about him, but he has written some remarkable pieces of work. For him to be writing in pen and paper, for all of his manuscripts before they go to editors, I find that really eye-opening because it takes a lot to write a book and then to have to go back and scribble through things. And so it actually makes me think it's a lot more a part of him knowing that he's written it with pen and paper than if he had, typed it up. So it's an interesting kind of insight, I think, into that author. So I'm going to move on now to modelled writing. This is explained on page 38. In the first workshop, I spoke about shared writing. So during this, I mentioned how shared writing is a part of that gradual release of responsibility model, which I do, we do, you do. Well, modelled writing is the first step, and it's so important that we get this first step right. It's a very planned strategy, model writing, even though it may be presented as quite ad hoc when you do it. When you are modelling writing, you need to be really mindful of what you're focusing on while you're doing this. So you need to think about what your goal is. Is it punctuation, spelling, a grammatical element, something about text structure or the text as a whole? Whatever you choose, you need to let your think alouds in the modelled writing be focused around that goal. I read a really interesting article about teachers who weren't planned in their model writing episodes, and it found that most teachers would revert back with their think alouds to things like spelling and punctuation, even if that wasn't their focus. And often what happened through this is students would get distracted with the learning, not be really sure about what they were meant to be focusing on, because the teacher seemed to talk a little bit about punctuation, a little bit about this, a little bit about that. And I know that I've done this myself, and I haven't been very planned about my modelled writing episodes. Actually, by making sure that I have that clear goal, when I haven't been planned, I have gone off topic and start chatting about other things. So I'd say here, step 0 before step 1, and write it down for yourself for modelled writing, is that you need to decide on your goal. So you need to have a really clear goal in mind of what you're going to be focusing on in this modelled writing. And then step 1 is to select your text type. So here, don't feel constrained in using always a similar text type. But if you do have a specific goal in mind, you'll need to choose a text type that will help you to portray it. So Narrative helped me to model concise planning to a group of my students. I was able to model how to construct a story map, which we'll talk about later, and then how that would translate into a story. And I chose this goal because I noticed that a lot of my students had trouble planning ahead in their writing. They were so keen to get started that they wouldn't think about how they would end. So this goal I could have used with many text types because planning happens across most text types, well, really all of them, I think, in some respect. But I chose narrative because that was something my students were really familiar with, and that was something that I noticed that their planning particularly went a bit crazy in. So step 2 here is that we need to start by explaining what you're writing, and you need to be really clear when you do this, when you're doing a modelled writing episode. The first few times it will feel a bit awkward, but you need to explain what your goal is in writing this. So today I'm going to write a story. I'm going to focus on planning a well-structured story. So you can see how I said my goal really clearly there, and then I might write that on the board, and then that can even be like a learning intention. If we all know David Hattie and you know, his work around learning intentions and goals for students, then the students will be able to tell you then at the end of your lesson if you achieve that learning intention in your modelled writing. And then when they go to write, they can tell you if they achieve that learning intention, or that goal. So share why you're writing the first few times. Be really clear as to why this matters. Write it up on the board. And also share who you're writing for. So telling students about this audience. Audience is something that's throughout the curriculum. Our students need to know a lot about audience. So let's model that to students. So I might say, I'm writing for the teacher, and then I'm going to explain why. So what I'm writing has to be really clear so my ideas are understandable. Or it might be that I'm writing for the preschoolers. So I know that today my vocab shouldn't be too complex. Or I'm writing to send this to our education minister. So I know that my writing needs to show a depth of vocabulary. So I'm explaining why that audience will, or how that audience will impact on the way that I'm writing. And you might write that down on the board as well as you explain it. Then, after explaining what you'll be writing about, begin writing. And as you do this, you need to talk aloud about what you're thinking. And these are called think alouds. And if you haven't heard of them before, I'm sure some of you would have, they are the gold of modelled writing. They're actual gold. So use them like gold. Be prepared here in what you want to say. If we talk the whole way through, students will, miss out on what the important information is. So to begin with, and still I sometimes do, I have all the points of what I want to say and when on a post-it note. So say if my goal is for students to write more engaging beginnings for their stories, as I would start writing, I would say, okay, so I've already planned my story, but I need to begin in a way that's going to hook in my reader. I know the first few words of my story are going to be the most important. So rather than starting with once upon a time, as that's very used, I'm going to start with some action to hook in my reader. I'm going to get straight to the complication of my story and slowly reveal the introduction. So to begin, I'm going to write, bam, the train came off the tracks with a jolt. So you can see how my think aloud, I'm trying not to distract from when I'm actually doing the writing, the process of writing. I'm talking through that process that I'm using as an author as I go to write. And really revealing these choices that I'm making as an author to the students should be something that I want the students to then internalise. I want my thoughts, my think alouds to become their thinking when they go to write. The fourth step talks about continuing this text and then developing this lesson into a joint construction in which the students participate. So you could then use this text to show editing skills, which if spelling or punctuation wasn't your main goal in your modelled writing, you can actually use it as a teaching point still in this step. I would advise though that you don't need to complete the whole text with students. It would be way too much teacher talk if we did this as teachers. especially in upper grades where the texts that we're writing with students are a lot more complex. So just complete the parts of the text that serve your purpose. Allow the students to practice this with you, a bit of joint construction then, and then allow them time to use the language focus of the lesson in their own writing and try to meet that goal. Because you can always come back to this text that you've started with the students at another time and with perhaps another goal in mind. And depending on your year group and your class will depend on how long you can keep your students engaged in model writing. But really, I'd suggest that 5 to 15 minutes is long enough for any student. 15 minutes might even be stretching it for a lot of our kids. Okay, I just want you to think about this, and you can feel free to share any ideas in the chat. I want you to think about that you're going to model for your students the writing of a crime story. And I want you to think about what would you say as a think aloud if you're considering your purpose of this story with the students, if you want them to tune into what the purpose of the story is. It might be a think aloud that you give your students. So when I'm thinking about the purpose for my students, and I'll let you keep writing if you do have an idea for this in the chat, and I'm thinking about crime story, I might even think about something like, my purpose here is to build suspense for the reader. So I'm not going to get to the problem very quickly, and I'm not going to try to solve it very quickly. I'm going to really stretch out that problem for my reader. So you can see how sometimes thinking through what your goal might be and what your think alouds will be does take a little bit of time, but it shouldn't take too long. It really, though, allows you to just be focused and plan for when you go to do that modelled writing episode. If you do have something to share, feel free to share it, but I'll keep moving. Okay, we're going to move on now to feature lists. Oh, beautiful. Yeah. So the purpose might be here that I want the students to open the story with a detailed description of the setting. And that might be what my think aloud is, okay, around purpose. So feature lists are explained on page 20 and also 70 and 71. And they're broken up between visual feature lists and written text feature lists. But I spoke about in our first workshop how actually what we're finding is more and more so these types of texts are actually combined, where we have the visual and the text together. So I think it's important to talk about these strategies as if they are combined. So you could flick to 20 or 70 or 71, see yourself where you'd like to go. The strategies in the book are slightly different, but this is basically the steps to the strategy. Feature lists are one of those strategies, though, that once you learn how to use them, it'll be second nature for you to use this when teaching writing or creating visual text. It's also a stepping stone in being able to critically analyse text, which we talked about in the first workshop. So this way it can really assist reading and comprehension as students know what they're looking for in the text. They're able to comprehend where the information is and what tells them that. I've used this strategy so many times over the years and in so many different forms. So the steps here are that we need to firstly select a text. We need to have some kind of text. And here again, think outside the box. I think standardised testing has got us thinking about only a handful of text types, narrative and persuasive. But teaching only these text types takes the whole genre approach to the extreme. The genre approach asks us to look at the text that we're surrounded by in everyday life and find the distinguishing features of them that match other texts. So some of the text types that I've used in the past have been really planned. Yes, I've used narrative, information report, persuasive ads, but at other times it's been text that my students I have come across in student inquiry. My students were watching an episode of War on Waste with Craig Rucastle a few years ago, and he was talking about at that point how states should start banning the plastic bags. And at that point in time, our state already had a plastic bag ban, but a few other states around Australia didn't. So during this episode, he actually asked, the viewers to write to their federal ministers and ask for a ban on the bags. So my students said, well, that's something that we want to do. That's a writing, task that we're really passionate about. Let's do that. So our text type then became letter writing, but almost a formal letter writing. And then in the end, it turns into kind of a formal email writing. And how do you organise an email to the minister to state what you want? And it was almost persuasive in a sense as well. So you can see this text type wasn't cut and dry. It didn't fit into an exact form of persuasive writing. It was a particular type of that. So secondly, here is the second step, is that you need to collect some examples. So when you collect examples, the aim here is to get a range of the text type, because you want students to be able to look through those text types and notice those similarities between them. You want students to be able to notice, like, oh, look, they all have titles. Or, oh, look, they all begin with these kinds of words. Or, oh, look, they all have numbers down the side. You might want to collect the text types, or it adds an element of investigation when you allow the students to do this. Whatever you do, make the examples that you select really authentic. We've got so much work as it is as teachers. Don't spend time writing procedures yourself. Don't spend hours of your day doing this. Find them in cookbooks, on building websites, on the back of frozen food packets. Make those texts that you show to students as authentic as possible, because in the end, we want our students to be writers for the real world, not writers for schools. So when doing a feature list on persuasive ads, I found a whole heap of these. And I actually showed, and here's an example of one that I found. I showed my students these persuasive ads, and then I allowed them to bring in some from home as they found them. So in that sense, it was kind of a guided investigation. I kind of showed students where the end goal was, but then they had the opportunity to bring in examples that they found around them as well. But also, in saying that, when students bring in things that aren't quite on target, you can talk about the differences here and what separates the subgenres almost. So when I've done narrative in the past, I did picture books with my students, and their end goal was to write a picture book for students in young year levels. So we looked at picture books and how they contained, and the way that the images worked with the text, and sometimes how they didn't, and the placement and the text of the images and all that kind of stuff. And then I brought in a non-example, The Stinky Cheese Man and Fairly Stupid Tales. If you haven't seen this book, it's a beautiful picture book, but it is it's a postmodern picture book. So in this, it's not linear at all. The narrator talks to the reader throughout, interrupts the stories, stops the stories halfway through. Some of them, the stories have like sub-stories inside them. And it really breaks that whole genre of picture books. So it makes students really consider, well, what are the features of the picture books that we'll be writing? Are they similar to this or different? So those non-examples can actually be really helpful here as well. I feel like the third step here, where you create a visual representation, this is where we really are most likely to miss when we're talking about feature lists. But it's important to make these features of a text visual for students, and to represent them in some way so that students can internalise the parts of a text, so they can replicate them when they go to write their own. What I've learned is that the chart needs to be memorable, whatever you do. So here's an example of a narrow burger. I got this idea from another teacher and I adapted it for my own class, where we talk about the narrow burger and that it has letters, which is our orientation, our meat, the big chunky part of the narrative is our complication, and the cheese kind of melting in all together and putting everything back together, like in a hamburger, is our resolution. And on there we'd write those parts of the different things that are in each of the parts of a narrative as well. So some of those text features. But this is a very basic one. You can become a lot more focused here on different kinds of language that you see, different punctuation you see. You can learn, write about the different ways that you can write an orientation, how you'd hook in a reader. I've done procedure pancakes. We've used recount roller coaster. All this kind of stuff can be a lot of fun. But make sure that you still allow some flexibility in it. So with the narrow burger, you know, I might have special sauces if there's other things that we find that we need to be able to fit in here. Or as optional extras that sometimes we use and sometimes we don't, depending on our purpose. And finally, and very obviously, a feature list should end with the students creating their own text. Students should look back at the feature list and be able to refer to it as they do this. And then the follow-up strategy is the one that I mentioned from the last workshop, where students complete a critical analysis of those text types that you've chosen. And looking at non-examples is a great way to get them started in this. Here are some other examples of feature lists that I've used in the past. And I'm going to talk about success criteria a little bit more later on when we talk about editing practice. But here you can see how success criteria can also work as a feature list. So we've got the parts of the narrative here, but then we've also got here some of the features in those parts. And here's an example of that information report, ice cream that I talked about before. And down the bottom, we've got a list of some of those features as well. And it's really important that you make these available enough for students that they can actually tick through those features as they're looking at their own text. And that's something I'm going to talk about in that editing checklist when we get to that part as well. Okay, so here's our activity. I'm going to get you to look at text type of school websites. And I want you to think about what you would add, what would you have on a feature list for them. So when you look at these, and I'm just going to put them in the chat now. Oh, whoops, that's the wrong one. Grab the right link for you. When you look at these, I want you to think about what do these have in common. What are things that you notice straight away? And I've chosen some that are from different schools in different states and different types of schools. So I've got some public, some private. Have a look at all four. I'd say open them up in your windows. And what are the first things that you notice that they all have in common? There really is no wrong answer here. So get chatting about it, pop it in the chat or talk on the mic. Something that you notice you'd put on a feature list for a school website if your job was then to design one. Yeah, they all have landing pages with headings along the top and a banner. They've all got photos, and we can be even more specific with the photos, can't we, Brittany? Yeah, the school logo is always there. Logo, there's a menu, there are headings. Do you notice anything similar about any of those headings? Yes, it's welcome. There's happy children photos. You don't have a picture of children hiding under desks, do you? You notice that all the children are facing the camera as well, so they're not like side on, not looking at their feet. An inspiring picture. Yeah, that's so true. That has to relate to the school values. You might notice as well that some of those banner images are moving across, that they're showing some of the facilities of the school as well. Colours are used. Yeah, you can talk about all the different colours as well in your feature list when you're talking about, well, school websites usually use these kinds of colours. And actually colours is a great topic there. You can really hone into it when you're talking about feature lists because lots of texts use different types of colours. Yeah, most have photos of people because they know that these are effective with online marketing. Great point there. Similar headings, that's right. They all kind of talk about curriculum, don't they? They talk about kind of our facilities. We can even talk about who's the audience of these websites, current happenings at the school. Is the audience students themselves? We can judge this. Yeah, parents, that's right. Prospective parents probably. They want parents to come to their school or send their kids to their schools. So that feature list can really be a lot of fun. It can be almost an investigation that you do with your students. And even getting your students to do a similar one to this, you know, if you're looking at websites or whatever text you're looking at, get them to look at their own school website. That's great. Great thinking, everyone. Thanks so much for your input in that. Okay, let's move on. If you still had something in the chat that you wanted to enter in there, feel free to pop it in there. So during the first workshop, I spoke about guided reading and writing conferences. And so the next 3 strategies will focus on developing the same outcome. So developing reading and writing skills, but they use slightly different means to get there. It doesn't mean that they're replacements for the other strategies. They can actually work well to complement them, but they'll suit certain cohorts of students better than others. And you're going to see that as we go through. Just in case I've missed anyone who's joined us, if you are teaching in junior years, could you please let yourself be known? By junior, I mean kind of preschool up to year 2. Is anyone in that area? Just pop it through on the chat as I start explaining this one. So we're going to talk about reading circles first. Reading circles is explained in, okay, so Savannah's in early childhood, great. So I'll make sure that I talk about early childhood here as well, because reading circles is explained on page 44 and 45. And it really is explained as an upper primary strategy, but I'll talk about how we can change that to junior school as well, because I know a lot of you, yes, you are teaching upper primary, but you might not be next year. You might be teaching kinder. So during the first session, I touched on how reading response journals could be incorporated into guided reading. Well, the reading circle strategy actually takes the use of a reading response journal into more of a formalised approach. So reading circles are also known as book clubs or book studies, and I might refer to them as these as I go through this as well. In this strategy, students are presented with book sets to choose from. So they have some choice in the book type that they're going to choose. And then they select a book they would like to read, and they read this book and respond to this book as they're reading, and share these responses with the other members reading a similar book to them. So the steps here are that you firstly need to explain this whole process. It has been modelled and explained to students. It is quite a process as well. The second step here is that you need to have selected some text for your groups. Again here, think outside of the box. I'd suggest selecting more text than number of groups that you have, because then if you use the ballot system where students have some choice over the text that they want, so they number them, then you can always find out, okay, well, that book wasn't popular at all. There was only one person, so I'll give them the second choice. But, you know, make this work for your own students. So thinking about some of those texts that you might choose, I know that it's hard to find book sets in a lot of schools. So think of different kinds of texts that you can use. I've used photojournalism ones. I use these beautiful pictures of survivors from different humanitarian disasters around the world, you know, survivors of war, survivors of famine, all these things that have happened. And there were images of these people who'd survived different things. And then on the back, there was a short bio of that survivor and what they'd been through. And I used those pictures as one of my book sets with students in year 5. And that was something that I found on the internet, one of those kind of Huffington Post things, printed out. I also have used newspaper articles, and I highly recommend Newsella if you haven't seen it. It's the site here, and I'll show you the website as well in a moment after I get through reading circles. So Newsella is a website where you can find newspaper articles. It is an American site, and you can actually adjust them to the reading level of your students. Although it's American and a lot of the news is American, there's a lot of scientific articles that I find are good on there. Also sometimes geography articles can be useful as well. So you can have newspaper articles on a certain topic. That could be one of your text sets. You could have photocopies of a selection of books. You could have just the author. So your authors are your different reading circles, perhaps from your author studies. You could use illustrators as your different text sets. or you could use comics. You can use just about anything. But the main aim is to give students similar books in their book studies or in their reading circles. So the third step here is that students will choose what books they want to read through a ballot system. Now, you know that this will probably end up being a bit of a social game where they'll want to be with their friends, but this can also think of it as a great teaching point for thinking about how do you work best, and students developing that insight in their work habits. So really making sure that they consider their work habits before their social friendships for their reading circles. The fourth step is that that you'll need to write or draw that whole process for students. It is really well explained in the book, so I don't need to go through step by step for you. However, I'd suggest the book talks about using 20 minutes for each strategy, for reading for 3 days and then responding, and then the next day discussing and sharing those responses. I'd suggest do what works for your classroom, and I'll show you some examples of how I would work this around depending on what class I had. The fifth step here is that you model some responses. And like when I talked about this similar strategy for guided reading, I would model those responses after I read aloud. So after I do my read aloud, I would show the students how I would be responding to that text. And it might be that you need a sentence starter or an idea to be responding to. So now I'm going to question the text. Or now I'm going to think about what if, or what will happen next, or where are they going with this, or you know, who is the main character and what are their feelings at this point. Now, step 6 is that the students will be reading and responding. Step 7 talks about letting this become a collaborative exercise where students decide the rules, so how long they read, where they might read to, where they are going to read. And this part of the strategy is where we see the strategy taken up a few grade levels. And I'd be okay doing this with mature year 5s and year 6 students, and definitely with secondary school, but not with much younger than that unless you have a very mature class. It's called a reading agreement. And it's here where you want the students to kind of take ownership over their book study groups. In step 8, the process continues with the collaborative input of your students. And I'd suggest even doing this as a class. You know, I'd talk as a class, okay, how long do you think we can read for in our reading circles? And at what stage do we all want to feedback? So you could have this as a class discussion with the collaborative input, and then that keeps this strategy in those younger years. Step 9 is where we allow the students to share their work. I've often made this a non-negotiable after a certain number of weeks. I found it was too difficult to wait for all students to finish reading because we know that they all read at different paces. So what I'd say is that, you know, week 9, we're all going to pause in our reading and you're going to share, we're going to practice what you're going to share as your response, as your presentation from your book study. You could get the students to share something very interactive, give them, you know, free range in what they share. But I've also done it where it's been very plain and almost scripted. You know, I want you to act out a part of your story, or I want you to write a fan fiction or a sequel. You don't want anything that'll take too much prep. You don't want your kids making crazy dioramas for weeks on end because you don't want to waste reading time. So whatever that group can construct in a cycle of 5 lessons, which might be a week or it might be more depending on what your lessons look like, that's what you want to give them to present. So I only give them 5 lessons to organise what their presentation will be. So where guided reading is really that strategy that can be used across year levels, but mostly in junior primary reading circles, is a strategy that really suits those upper primary and middle school kids. However, if you're keen to try it in the early years, you need to think about using responses that are less formalised. You might want to give students sentence starters for their responses, or thinking cards. I've used De Bono's hats, where, you know, they take out the black hat, and so they think about the negatives, and then they take out the yellow hat and they think about the positives of what they've read. Or they might have question cards with who, when, where and why, and they answer these questions as their response. So really quite structured responses. Or it might be that they're drawing their responses if they're pre-writers in even younger year levels, or even recording them digitally. And this might work wonders as well for students with special needs. Getting students to record their response to what they've read that day using microphone or using webcam can be another great way of getting students to respond to what they've read. The session should only run for as long as your students can read it independently as well. So it doesn't have to be the 20 minutes that is explained in the book. You might want it only for 5 or 10 minutes to begin with, depending on your students. And this really would make up a huge part of your students' reading. So the basic idea here is to have these mini book clubs that will allow students to engage in a text. I've got a little activity here before I show you Newsletter and then show you how I would suggest that you run these reading circles. I want you to reflect on your own experience of book clubs. If you've been in one, participated, or if you've run them in schools already, what have you found to be good parts about book clubs, or what parts have you found challenging? It might be something that challenged you yourself. It might be something that you found challenging running them as a teacher. It might be something positive that you got out of book clubs yourself, or positive that you found from running them. Just take a moment to reflect and share with each other on your experience of book clubs. So you haven't actually got to be in a book club yet, Savannah? No. Has anyone been in a book club? Or is anyone in one currently? Yes, let's become more chat club. And I think that's so true, Lucia. It gives you that reflection of actually sometimes it becomes almost a friendship group, you know, book clubs. So you've got to think about that when running it for students, you know, at what element or what line do we draw between socialising, sharing books with my friends, that's so true. What line do we draw between socialising and reading and sharing our responses? And for me, I always make that line a little bit blurry. I like to let my students socialise if they can in their book clubs. Buddying students as well in book clubs can be a great way to do it. Participating in book clubs myself, I'm quite a slow reader. And so what I always found was that I'd be left behind. Everyone else would be up, like finish the book or up to this chapter, and I'd be going, oh, I haven't got up to that part yet. So I think that that's something that I've learned from my participation in book clubs, where actually it's good to allow students to go at their own pace. Something I've definitely got out of book clubs is I've been able to, like it's mentioned here, that you get to share books among your friends. I've learned about so many other genres and authors that I really like that I hadn't known about previously. If you haven't been a part of a book club, I highly encourage you to give it a shot. Even start one at school, between the teachers. It'll be a lot of fun. So here are some alternative ways to running these reading circles. The first is what's explained in the book. So you read and respond for 3 days, reading for 20 minutes and responding after that 20 minutes. Day 4, you share these responses in your group, and day 5, the students will write a journal response. They're not actually writing until day 5. What I found tricky with this is that I wanted my students would forget about what they'd read by the time they went to write their journal response. So the way that I thought about changing this is that I could either have the students read on the first day, then respond the next, read again, respond, and then share. And then finally what I came up with was that students would read and respond in their journal during that reading time, and they'd share the next day. Reading, responding in their journal and sharing the next day. Reading, respond and sharing. And this kind of alternate way of doing it meant that it didn't matter if we, kept missing out on that 5th day, or if that 5th day kept being moved backwards. It meant that we were either up to one or the other. So I didn't have to keep track as much of where we're up to. But it also meant that I was limiting that sharing time. So that sharing time, although it was frequent, it was only that one session. And then the next session would be a time where we could just focus on reading and responding. And then the following session would be a sharing session. So you'd have these quite chatty sessions, and then you'd have the quiet, reflective reading sessions. And that's one way that I made this work. But you can see how it's flexible, reading cycle's flexible, and how you make it work for your class and your needs. I was just going to show you ALEA as well. Let me go to that website. And I'm just going to do new share. I'll just do this screen for you. Okay, so ALEA. As I said, it's a US site. There's there's the website for you as well. And here you can sign in as a teacher using Google. You can also get students to connect to it using Google Classrooms if you use those, so you can assign articles for them. But if you're going to use these articles for book clubs, what you could do is you could find some articles that you're interested in. So I'm just going to go back one more and see if it shows you a list of some of the articles. So you can have a look around and see, yeah, there you go, some of the articles that are published here. These articles are all from well-known publications, and then you can actually search them depending on text level. So they've kind of leveled these to give us an idea of what reading level they would suit. And up here in this column, you can actually change that reading level to make it easier for your students to read, which would mean that you can still have varied abilities in your reading groups. So, what's it saying at the moment? Let's make it this, and then we'll see. And you can see it changes the text to make it an easier Lexile level. So ALEA, keep that in your binder. It's really good for finding non-fiction texts and being able to make them suit your students and their abilities. And definitely mixed ability. And there's so many articles in here. There are quite a few that you can access, I think, freely, but you can sign in with Google Chrome or your Google account. Okay, back to slideshow. Okay, we're going to move on now to shared reading as the next strategy. So I talked a lot about read alouds, and I talked a bit about them tonight as well. But when I think of shared reading, I think of those hot reads, those read alouds that Stephen Lane introduced me to. And after hearing him talk about these hot reads, where you really take a text and you try to sell it to your students, I decided to take that idea and adapt it to my class. So rather than just being a book that you promote to your class, I decided that I wanted to read my hot read to my class every day, the same one, every day for a week. And so at this stage, I was teaching year 2. So I could read the whole text every day with my class. And I was really surprised that my students actually liked this. They were in year 2 at the time, and I thought that they would actually get quite bored with the same text, having it day after day. But what I found is after a day or 2 of me reading, the kids would actually join in the reading. And this is really what shared reading is. It's taking that strategy of read alouds to the next level by sharing the story with the class more than once, so they're able to internalize it and read the story with you. So all these strategies and hints I spoke about for read alouds also apply here, that you choose something that you love, that you rehearse it, that you add the expression and your pace and your rhythm, and that you allow students to respond once you finish. But these steps are very much the same for read alouds, but there are a few additional steps, and that is to reread, to reread, and to reread. And each time you do this, you allow the students to join in with the reading. Now, this might mean that you need to slow your pace at times. You might have a signal, okay, you say, and then I'm going to say, or it might be that I'm going to read a page and then you're going to read the next one. It is a perfect way to teach students different reading strategies. And you can see a list of these on these pages, 56 and 57. However, it also assists students to internalise a story structure, and it enhances their vocabulary by exposing them to a range of language. It really does develop that read loud strategy. I shared the story in the first workshop of how I read The Magic Hat to the group of ELAD Kinder students as my read aloud. Well, this was the book that I used for shared reading. I read it every day to the class, and then slowly they were able to join in. And after a week, this class was able to read this book along with me and read it independently of me. So these ELAD students, pre-readers themselves, through shared reading, were able to read a text. It just blew my mind. So then they were able to actually internalise that story structure, and we were able to talk about the way that this story was structured, and we made story maps, and we could look at the language features of narrative. So I think because there are so many texts and so much choice that's given in this book, what a really nice activity to do now is to think about what your favourite text is to read aloud and to share it with everyone this evening. What is one of the books that you love to read aloud to students? And let's have a little bit of a collaboration now. Yes, Dr. Zeus is so much fun to read aloud. So true. Does anyone else have other read alouds? And they don't have to be a junior. It could be that you like to read part of a text in senior. It might be a text that you were read aloud to. We're going on a bear hunt. Beautiful. Another classic. Oh, anything by Julia Donaldson's amazing. Room on the Broom, oh, I love it as well. And The Highway Rat is another one of my favourites. Don't open this book, so much fun. Yes, any of the Treehouse books, and Wonder is just gorgeous, isn't it? It's a beautiful read aloud or shared reading. And if you are going to do a shared reading with an older text as well, you know, putting it up on the smartboard, getting the students to read along with you or to read a part of it, or, you know, if you don't have a smartboard handy, even having some copies of the text out. Series of Unfortunate Events, another great one. Anything by Mem Fox is all good. What was another one? Oh, my son at the moment is really into The Magic Faraway Tree. So some of those classics as well, where the language is just amazing. Those can be your shared reading. The Twits, oh, such a great shared reading. Such a great shared reading. Not a lot of text on each page, quite visual. Yes, Enid Blyton has such, yes, exactly. That's it. As I'm reading Magic Faraway Tree, my husband's reading Magic Faraway Tree to my son, we're both like, oh, I love this part. Or like, now we're getting to this chapter. There's another great book by Emily Rodder, and it's a picture book called Power and Glory. Excellent read aloud picture book, I'd say for upper years as well. It talks about video games, but for each word she has an image and a great shared reading to have because it's very memorable and it's one of those repetitive stories that students can really join in with. Wow, some great ideas there. Thanks, everyone. If I was you, I would copy and paste that list and keep it for your shared reading planning. Okay, let's move on to editing practice. So editing practice is explained on page 17. I've already mentioned it a little bit, but now we're going to go into it a bit more deeply. So editing practice fits in well with the process writing approach, in which you might be expecting students to edit their own writing or their peers' writing independently as they work through the writing cycle. So if you aren't familiar with the writing cycle, it's a student-led approach in which students develop writing by going through stages that should replicate what authentic writers do. So the stages here are that students pre-write. They think up ideas, they get ideas for writing. Then they draft their writing, they revise it themselves, they edit it, or they get a buddy to edit it, and then they publish. So in the first session, the first workshop, I talked about conferencing. And conferencing is really that, writing conferencing is really something that happens at any point in the writing cycle. You can conference with students at any point in this writing cycle. So this writing cycle is kind of continuing on. As you are doing your conferencing, your students are continuing on their writing in their writing cycle. It replicates what authentic writers do. I've used this model a lot in my classroom and in different forms. Sometimes I make the parts very clear what I want them to do at each stage, and sometimes it's more broad. I've even used this in very early years. I often make that self and peer edit explicit here. So you can see there's a partner check and then there's a self edit here. Because I want to ensure that my students do these edits and actually get their peers to edit their work. And before getting into this writing cycle, I ensure that my students have completed some editing practice. And this is what this topic or this strategy is specifically about, that editing practice. How do you do that? So step one is to provide a text with areas. Now, you can use one of your students' texts, or you could have prepared one previously. But what's really fun and takes the work out of it is to use some of that modelled or jointly constructed writing that you've done in your class and copy it so that each student has a copy of this and edits it individually. If you do model this stage, you know, give your students also a paper copy so that they're following it along with you. So like everything, step two, it's really necessary that you model and explain what an editor does. So be really specific here depending on what your expectations are. And talk about the fact that, you know, as an editor, you're generally looking at the writing craft. You're not necessarily looking at the punctuation. So not to get caught up in the punctuation and capitals, but even to look at how is it structured? What would make this text better? What takes away from this text? For younger years, I want students to take 2 different coloured pencils with them, one for self-edits and one for buddy edits. I often give students success criteria to formalise, or an editing checklist to work through as they go. And I'll show you some examples of these, even though there are some examples also in the book of this. During those buddy edits, I expect students to give each other one positive and one negative or constructive piece of feedback, and that needs to be written on their page. I also want to see that students self-edits in their writing as well. Having that checklist can also be a way of the student showing me that they've checked off that they've got these things in their writing. And they might pick up on things that they didn't think about, or conversely, the buddy might notice some things that the student didn't notice in their writing. I had students also use goal cards, so they might be looking for specific goals when they're editing, that, you know, they have speech in their writing, and then that might be on their gold card speech. So then they're highlighting that they've done that. And then their buddy might be looking at their speech as well and seeing, can they add in anything? Have they done it correctly? The third step here is that you need to give the students that time to edit. Now, when you are doing editing practice, don't leave this too long. It's good to give kind of just a short time because we know students will move at different paces. And once a few students have finished the editing practice, it's a good time to stop. Because it's better to have a few editors going than many students waiting for others to finish. And then fourthly, we mark the text as a class. So make this a collaborative activity where you have students firstly share maybe with a partner or the table group first, and then you can edit it together. You can talk about what people's ideas were, what they noticed. So here are some examples of some success criteria or editing checklists that I use. So these were kind of those success cards that I talked about, where you might have a speech card. These ones focused on processes. So having behaving, doing, thinking and saying processes in their writing, and students might choose one that was going to be their goal and they'd focus on in their writing, and then they'd go through and edit their writing, checking that they'd met that goal. Here's another example of success criteria. You can see this one's quite specific, where we have the parts of the information report, and then actually ticking off that they've got a definition or a classification, an overview. And so you can see it's really about that writer's craft here. Have they got all the information that's needed in here? You could make that a below, at and above, almost like a rubric style of, you know, where are we expecting to be? Okay, if you're here, how can you move your writing to here? And this is another example of kind of a similar rubric style success criteria, where students can see if they've got it, if they don't quite have it, or if they don't have it at all. And what the aim here is not for students to tick not at all. It is for them to notice what they don't have and be able to move that tick to, okay, I've got it, or I'm not quite sure if I've got it, so I'm going to put it not quite here. I've kind of given it a shot. A really great way for students to not only edit their own work, but also to have an understanding of that editing process, of the criteria, and be able to almost self-assess as they're editing. I've got a little activity here, and if you can think of anything, feel free to share it in the chat. It's a student's text that I'm going to show you. I want you to think about, what would you suggest for an editing checklist if you were to use this text in your class for editing practice? So what would you put on an editing checklist if this was the text that you were going to show your students in a class? You can think about writer's craft. You can think about punctuation, if that's something that you think your students would need on the editing checklist. You could be really specific and say, you know, make sure that for the spelling, like if that's going to be something that you want there, that words that you're unsure of are underlined, because, you know, if the students are going to sentence length, great one. Yep. Sentence structure. Yep. And it might be something that, you know, you want students to underline if they notice that a word is spelled incorrectly, or you want them to circle each full stop just to check that they've got them there, if that's a real goal of your students. Beautiful. Great suggestions, guys. Thank you. Yeah, to reread, does my work make sense? To check that each sentence has a noun in it, or doing, because we've got eating chocolate here, we don't know who or what's eating chocolate, so to check you know, that you have participants in your clauses as well. That could be something, you know, but you could be as specific as that, or you could be really broad, and I like the idea of just talking about sentence length or rereading, you know, to have these specific goals where students can go, yep, I have checked that off. So think there as well. You might start with really broad goals, which is fine, and what you'll notice is actually I need to be a bit more specific about what I actually want them to do there. Okay, so I finished the first workshop off with a few kind of extras, which were some strategies that hopefully you could find helpful in your everyday. And that's how I want this workshop to end as well. We still have quite a few strategies we're going to go over, with a few of these kind of favourite strategies that I think could be added into your planning as you need them, but may not be a daily or even a weekly practice depending on your class. And we're going to start out with a real fun one called choral reading. This is explained on page 12. So choral reading can be so much fun. I found it can really develop students' awareness of text and their structure, and you will find it really assists students' fluency as they learn that reading aloud is a thoughtful process in which you need to tap into the rhythm and pattern of a text. So their fluency will just skyrocket through choral reading. It's also a very collaborative activity, which is a great thing to do as a whole class, where students have to develop a choral reading together and work out what parts they're going to read and how they're going to devise the text. So the steps here are that firstly you need to select a text that will be easily divided into parts and will suit this kind of approach. So I'd suggest choosing something that has a rhythm or a pattern to it. I often use poetic texts, and I think that that's also what's mentioned in the book, to use texts that have some kind of poetry or rhythm in them for choral reading. So I love the Natural Disaster series by Jackie French and Bruce Watley. Has anyone seen these? Fire is one of the books in the series. There's also Flood. There's another one as well. It's a beautiful series, and they're very poetic and very powerful. Drought, that's it. Cyclones, yes. Thank you. So they work wonders for choral reading. And if you want something a bit more fun, I like Sister Madge's Book of Nuns. If you do, no, I think we got it. Cyclones are not so great, but the book is great. I've also used Sister Madge's Book of Nuns. It's a book of kind of humorous poetry by Craig Smith. Again, a really fun one for choral reading. This strategy lends itself to narrative really well. You know, Mulga Bill's Bicycle and all that kind of thing, where you're kind of telling a story. And there are great suggestions in the book for other texts to use if you really don't have any ideas. So the second step here is that you read the text to your class so that they comprehend it first, and that you want them to be listening to it for any pattern or rhythm they can hear. So you tell them that. You tell them what you want them to be listening to. You want them to be listening with intention of what they'll be doing next. You know, you talk about, if we're going to read this as a group, how could we make this book come alive? In what parts would we all read? In what parts would some people read? Would we whisper parts? Would we yell other parts? And then the third step is where it becomes really collaborative. So here you have the students suggest ideas for the reading. You start really generally, like, are there any parts in which we should all read? And you highlight these. And then you become more specific about who will read what and how. And you have a system to mark these for your students. I usually have a text on the smartboard as I'm doing this, and I'm highlighting and putting our notes in and our comments as we're working through. And then you need to rehearse this. And I've even had students record their rehearsals. It allows students to self-evaluate their reading if you've got these recordings that they can listen to. And it also helps them to remember the text again. If you're listening to yourself say something over and over again, you learn the text again. And I really wish that I had the recordings of this group of students who actually read the Fire book as a choral reading piece, because it was just so powerful. But yes, definitely record it. Because finally, this strategy does become a performance strategy. You know, and you can perform this strategy however you'd like. It could be something that you display at a school assembly, and that was how I used this strategy, but it could also be something that you share on a school Facebook page or a website, or you even share it on a school podcast, which I know a lot of schools are now doing podcasts, or it could even be over the PA system at your school. It is a performance strategy, and so that's also why I'm sharing it, because I think at this point in the year where we've got, you know, end of year spectaculars and everything happening, you might want to do a choral reading. A really powerful way of, you know, encouraging reading in your school and sharing great texts. So here's the activity, and it's a bit of a curly one, this one. I thought we could have a go at doing a choral reading together. Now, it might be a little bit glitchy, and I don't know how well it'll work because we are all online. But for this, I'm going to need you to turn your microphones on. And also, I organised this choral reading in advance, as you can see, with the hope that we'd have someone from Tasmania, which I think we have, people from Queensland. I don't know if we have anyone from Queensland here. And someone from New South Wales. Oh yes, thank you, you're from Queensland. Is there anyone from New South Wales? We've got Tasmania. I know we've got someone from WA. Is that right? So what if, so Larissa, let's just pretend that New South Wales says WA. And you're our New South Wales person, okay? Yay! All right, let's give this a shot. I'm going to read it through first, how I think we'll make it sound. And then, as you can see, I want you to try to read the part that has the text there. So, you know, me, and then anyone from Tas, and then we'll all read this part, and then anyone from Queensland, and then me, and then our people from New South Wales, which is Western Australia, and then all of us, okay? I'm going to read through first, so you don't have to read yet. This is what I think it sounds like. One small spark brought fire awake, winding like a small black snake. Fire flickered, fire crept, flames snickered, bushfire leapt. Air too thick with ash to see, dry winds lash a bushfire sea. Time to run, time to flee. And we can even like yell that part if you want to. All right, let's give this a shot. Turn on your microphones. All good? Okay. Here we go. One small spark brought fire awake.
Winding like a small black snake.
Fire flickered, fire crept.
Flames snickered, bushfire leapt.
Air too thick with ash to see.
Dry winds lash a bushfire sea.
Time to run, time to flee. Yay! Well done, everyone. I'm so impressed. That's amazing. All the people who get the recording are just going to love that. That was a bit of fun. And it was so much fun, so powerful. And what a great way to get your kids into text and to work on that fluency and in a way that you're collaborating and sharing. Lots of fun. Thank you. You guys are amazing. Okay, so let's move on now to storyboards. Storyboards are explained on page 59 of the text. If you want to move to page 59 now. I'm going to be talking about them a lot, so and kind of in an alternative way to how they're explained in the book. So I'd suggest that you do open up that page or that you have some note paper to make some notes on. Storyboards are described as a very structured strategy in the book and just for one main purpose, which is to understand the structure of a narrative. Now, I think this is a really important use for them. And I've used this in the way a lot of the time, particularly in my endeavour to get my students thinking about their narrative writing, as I talked about before, in their narrative planning. When they've needed that help in planning stories that would take forever to resolve, storyboards are often a great way of getting students to think through their planning, only having details in their stories that are necessary. So the author here, when they're thinking about a story, does need to think about each detail that they're including, and a storyboard makes students think through that. Now, this then translates into students using storyboards to plan their own narratives, to ensure that all the details that they use serve a purpose of their story. Storyboards also make a really excellent assessment of visual literacy. So often when I've shown students short clips or any moving image, I can get students to then record what they saw, what they tuned into, and I can see how students are interpreting moving images and their visual literacy and what parts they're cluing into. It can also help students pick apart visual narratives and critique these. So we spoke about that in the first workshop. When you're doing a critical analysis of visual image, you know, if you're using a movie, we'll use a storyboard first, get the students to storyboard out what they saw in that short clip or that movie, and then they can critically analyse what they saw. They're also great for planning any kind of movement. So when our students are writing texts that involve movement, or if they're doing drama, or if they're doing dance, they can plan it out using a storyboard. I've most recently used them when students were developing Scratch presentations. So you can see here students developing a Scratch presentation on the computer here. Scratch is a coding program in which students can make little figures move, words come out, they can change backgrounds. And because this is moving images, storyboards work really well as the planning device for these. So now that I've said all of that, let's have a look at the steps and have a pen ready to write down some of the suggestions that I make. So firstly, choose a text. Here we're going to assume that you're using storyboards for narrative structure to demonstrate narrative well. Start with something that the students know. It could even be the text that you use for your read aloud or your shared reading, or it might be that short film, the Pixar short film that you're going to look at. Use a text that the students know and model how you do, how you'd make that storyboard. So in the second step here, we explain that storyboards actually come from a background of visual storytelling. They're used to depict movement in 2D form. We need to explain this to students so that they know that there's a specific way of using a storyboard. We model how we use them to ensure that there's overlap between the frames, that the characters might overlap or the settings might overlap. The third step here is that we model and we jointly construct a storyboard. Now, I'd suggest that you construct at least the first and second box independently of the students so that they have an idea of what a storyboard looks like, and then you allow them to share their thoughts on what should come next. So never assume that every student is on board and knows what they need to do before you do some modelling. Always model before you jointly construct. Fourth step. So then you construct a feature list, which we talked about before, of what needs to be included, especially what you want included in the images and what kind of text you want it included underneath. I really want Ron and my students to be really brief in their text, so that actually needs to be in my feature list. You know, underneath there should only be 1 or 2 sentences explaining what you're going to put in that frame. The fifth step here is so that the students will then create their storyboards. Now that might happen a few days later or on the same day. Now, it doesn't have to be with a paper and a pen. Now, we talked about the importance of writing with pen and paper, and there is importance to that, but I know that there's also, it's a very engaging way to use digital technologies when you're looking at storyboards, and there are so many digital tools for storyboards out there. And I'd highly recommend that you go and check these out. They can be so engaging for disengaged writers, and it's something that I've used with disengaged writers throughout the year, getting my students to put together the storyboard as their draft, and then, you know, we edit it together, we talk about their story. Sometimes we can translate this into writing, sometimes it stays as a storyboard and they just add detail to it and present it almost as a comic strip. You know, you might ask for little or limited text here, but you can also, they talk about having only 8 frames in a storyboard in the book. Now, I suggest actually having more than that if you are going to do a paper copy, and printing your storyboard on both sides. So students have kind of unlimited storyboards if they want them. Have extra sheets as well, because it's better for students to have access to more frames rather than have this limited amount of 8. Yes, you don't want your storyboards to go on forever and ever, but you also don't want your students to feel restricted. They can cross out boxes later that way. They can change boxes if you do want them to edit it down to 8 boxes or 10 boxes. And then the 6th point here is that we finally need to use them in some way. So just like any strategy, you don't just do it for the sake of doing it. You're going to use this as a launch pad for writing or for creating or responding to something that they've watched or listened to. So let's have a look at an online storyboard creator. I'm going to give you the link, or actually no, let's just have a look at it together and I'll pop the link in the chat. Going to share it this way. Okay. So Storyboard That is one that I've used in the past. It is free to use. You don't need to log on. You can literally just go on it and you can start making storyboards. You can choose backgrounds, you can choose characters, you can put in text, infographics, and then you can do screenshots of it, or you can just copy it and save it as well to your computer. Really helpful one to use in a class, especially if you know you have laptops that move around, or you might be using iPads one day, laptops the next. But a really engaging one to use as well. So if you are thinking of using storyboards as a prompt for writing, or maybe even as your end result in writing, Storyboard That I think is a really helpful online tool to use. And that link is in there for you now in the chat if you want to copy it over. I'm also going to make sure that you get a copy of all the links that I'm giving you later on when you get a follow-up email from Robin about these workshops. So if you're not taking note of them now, that's fine too. We'll get them later. So our activity was for you to create a storyboard using Storyboard That, but I'm going to leave that for now. I think that's something that if you are interested, you can do that in your own time as well. Have a play around with it. So here are some examples of storyboards as well. I spoke about before how I give students that unlimited frames in their storyboards, so back-to-back sheets and multiple sheets, and you can see that sometimes students use all of them and sometimes they only use a few. And these students really got that idea of the crossover between the frames so that their character was in the same place, and then that they were only changing one or two things each time. Yes, it was a really brief storyboard, but they had that information underneath. It was really specific and detailed so that I had that information of what would be happening in each frame of these were their scratch storyboards. Again, this student had another storyboard. They had a lot of crossover in their frames, but they had a lot of action taking place in between these. So they really wanted to show me, okay, this is going to happen and this is going to happen. So be really specific about how much you're expecting, how much information you're wanting between these storyboards. Really great way to plan text. Okay, now we've talked about a lot of different strategies this evening, but I feel I'd be doing you a bit of a disservice if we didn't touch on a spelling strategy. During the first workshop, some participants asked how spelling fits into all of this. Well, I believe that spelling is a skill that can be developed in reading and writing, so they're in those programs as well. But I think also that the words that we're studying should really come from authentic things that we're doing in our class, not from spelling lists. So they should come from our reading and our writing. And word sorts, which is the next strategy we're going to be talking about on page 76, they're one of these effective strategies to have up your sleeve if you want that spelling program that is text rich, so using the text in your class, and it's authentic. So I've used word sorts in varying degrees across different year levels over the years. I found them useful in junior years when you're trying to get kids to tune in to the patterns of words. So you're really looking at, oh, you know, all these words have this sound in them. What letters could be making that sound? And they're really great, I guess, for that inquiry into words. I've also used a variation of them, though, when I've been teaching in senior years, and my students are focusing then on word etymology, which is words' origins or words' roots. Word sorts really remind us that spelling is much more than just about lists of words. In fact, spelling, you know, should never be just a 10-word weekly spelling test, because research has shown that isn't effective. Spelling needs to be this inquiry into language where we notice patterns and question these, and word sorts are one way that can help us do this. So word sorts have been used really extensively in the ACT, and I'm sure many states have used programs that have had word sorts in them. I know that I've used B spelling and Words Their Way, but what I like about this book is that the words aren't necessarily have to be pre-written into a word sort, and a lot of those pre-written word sorts that come from programs actually don't have the Australian pronunciation in mind, so actually can sometimes be a little bit off. So refreshingly, this book describes devising our own lists of words for word sorts. And I'd encourage you to make these lists that you make as contextualised as possible. So, like I was talking about, you know, we might have that author study, that book that we're reading in class, we'd be taking the words for our word sort from those books. You might have a specific goal in mind, like sounds that you're looking for as you're looking through these books, or, you know, word types or word roots. Or you might be taking words from topic areas. Think about all that great language that you find in different subject areas, you know, in geometry, in maths, in history. And by discovering these words for word sorts, you know, with your students, you won't need to check that they know the meaning of these words because they will have already been using them in class. They'll be familiar with this language that you used from this book, that you read in this book, and the pronunciation of them because you've been reading this book together. So I'll show you a short clip of how you can do this as well, how you can find these words in the books that you're reading in a moment. Secondly, it's really important to jointly complete a word sort before you allow students to do it independently. You need to model, again, that thinking that needs to occur while you're sorting the words. Again, make notes here of what you plan to say. So using those post-it notes. Now, it's encouraged that you complete a closed word sort, which is where those categories of how you're sorting the words are predetermined. You know, words that make the O sound using these letters and using these letters and using these letters. But I'd suggest having an open sort as well, and also modelling this, where you don't have preset categories. You actually just look at the words as a whole and you inquire into any of those patterns that you might see between words. This can be a really rich discussion where students start coming up with things like, oh, some of them start with an A, okay, well, let's put those together. That can be our first category. I've also found always the need for an oddball category, and this is something that I learned in Words Their Way. When you have words that don't quite fit in any of the other categories, having an oddball category, students can then put words that they don't know fit into any of the others into this category. If you can't find a word that goes anywhere else, pop it in that oddball category, even in an open sort. After you feel that you've modelled and jointly constructed enough word sorts for the students to understand how to do them, give the students their own sets of words to sort. Now, you might do this that all the students have the same list that you're doing together. You might have different students using different lists. You might have students constructing their own lists, so individual lists, and then sorting these. Ensure that you allow them some open and some closed sorts, and it's an incredibly rich task if you allow the students to find their own words from the text they're reading, or from even words that they're struggling to spell in their own writing. Because then they can be noticing different things in those words, and maybe it might be those things that they keep getting tripped up on. Finally, sharing word sorts can be a lot of fun. Students can see then, as they share with other peers, how their peers sort those words in a variety of ways. And if they have the same list, they might be sorting them, slightly differently still. It adds this extra element of spelling inquiry to the strategy and really cements that learning if they have to share what they've noticed in their word sorts. I've got this website here as well. It's a goldmine if you are starting to look at word origins and root words. It's Etymology Online site. Some of you might already be quite familiar with it. It's an excellent website if you are starting to look at kind of where words come from. And what you can do in this site is you can actually have a look. You can type in any word. So this is the site. You can type in any word and you get the history of that word. So where are we starting? Just gone straight to C. Let's say, oh look, there's all, that's a great word for it to be the trending word, self. So then here we get this etymology or this history of the word. We can see where the word came from, and it's really great for that, that spelling inquiry. So if you don't know about this website, Etymology Online, do save it. It is absolute gold when you're doing kind of that spelling inquiry. I'm putting it in the chat now. But think about as well that the words that you're sorting with your students, they can be sorted in a variety of ways. So you might have all the students have the same list, but you might actually, so we're going to look at a video for a word sort in a moment from Tessa DeFern. And if you're unsure about these word sorts or spelling in general, do have a look at Tessa's website. She has some great resources there as well for primary year spelling. So these words that say, the students have gotten from a text or they've gotten from their writing, we think about, well, how could these be sorted? If we had an open sort, we could sort them in a variety of ways, but maybe I've got closed sorts and I say, I want you to sort them in syllables. And the students could then sort the words by syllables. And then we use that same list the next day or the next week when we come back to spelling and we go, okay, let's now sort them by grapheme. So now we're looking at the different ways that that A sound is made. The spelling of that A sound. Or we could even sort them by the parts of speech. So now we're looking at the verbs and the nouns here. I spoke before that I wanted to show you a video of how you'd find those words, if you were doing a word sort and you were wanting it to come from an authentic text that you were reading. And this is a video from Tessa's site where she shows how she would go through the process of sorting words with kids or constructing a word sort. So I'm just wanting to show you this video.
Never a please or a thank you. The rat carried on in this way.
So using rich text, authentic text. The students then recording words
Flies from a spider.
The sound that they're looking for. So they're actually kind of doing
Milk.
word hunting, which is a lot of fun.
From a cat.
Delight.
And then they're highlighting the word,
Right.
the pattern, the spelling pattern that is making this I
Right.
sound.
Cyclone.
I think this is important as well, that Tessa talks about that they need this exposure to the word for actually finding the words once, writing them again, and then writing them down, ready for your words. So now they're writing them on cards, ready to sort them.
Tie.
But actually that writing process is further developing students' knowledge of these words. So they're, ingraining these words.
Tie.
Now you can see this is a closed sort, so they've got their headings there,
Lie.
the different spellings of the I sound, and they're sorting these words that they found in the book under each of those headings.
Why?
What they don't have here is that oddball category where they might go, I'm not quite sure there.
Sky.
Saying the words as well helps the students to really hear that sound.
Tight. Glide.
And then she keeps going. We're highlighting those sounds again and then moving that on. Where does that go after here? So talking now more about that meaning part of the word. So there's just an example of how it might look in your classroom if you're getting students to find words with certain sounds in them. Okay. Now, let's go back to our slides and for our quick wrap up. From the first workshop, I talked a lot about the fact that when we're doing any kind of work with students, especially conferencing with them, we give them one goal or one takeaway, something to take with them, something that they feel they can work on that is doable, and a goal for them to kind of be able to put into practice. And I want you to think through that again before we finish up this evening. You know, what is the goal or the takeaway for you from this evening? Is it the author studies? Is that something that you've found that you really want to do? Is it modelled writing? Is it using success criteria or that editing checklist that you want students to develop their editing skills? Is the choral reading and you'd really like your students to develop their choral reading and you're going to give that a good shot and goal? Is it that you're going to try to do some word sorts with your students or storyboards? Whatever it is, just take a moment to reflect for yourself, or maybe it's the reading circles even, and we spoke a lot about them. Have a moment to reflect what your goal, your takeaway might be from this evening's strategies workshop. And now we have a little bit of time for some questions. If you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. It can be about any of the strategies that we covered this evening, or it could be about a strategy that I talked about from the last workshop. I'm happy to answer questions, or it might be about a strategy that I haven't even talked about. We can all have a little chat about now. Oh, nice. So choral reading and storyboards, yeah, choral reading. You've been using the class meetings. It does. Brittany, I just found class meetings made me realise what kind of a teacher I wanted to be, and they made me realise I really want that democratic classroom. Like I really want a classroom that can work stuff out themselves, and it can be such a social skilling activity to do. I'm glad that everyone liked choral reading. That was a bit of a fun one. Yes, I'll share the link for that one. So that's from Tessa DeFern's website. Let me just see if there's I might just share it as I close up the recording though. If you Google Tessa DeFern under her primary resources as well though. So, as we finish up this evening, I truly hope that the strategies book has opened up your eyes to different ways of doing things in your classrooms. Because I know that there are so many roadblocks to good teaching. There are tests, there are programs, there are administrators, there are parents, and all the other different voices that tell us that we have to do things one way or another way. And I really encourage, and my hope for all of you is that although you might have to listen to some of these voices, there is still space for change in our profession, and positive change in the way that we teach and the way that we allow our children in our classrooms to blossom. And I just love this quote from Silverstein that is, listen to the mustn'ts, child, listen to the don'ts, listen to the shouldn'ts, the impossibles and won'ts, listen to the never has, and then listen close to me. Anything can happen, child, anything can be. So try out that strategy that you've been thinking about or wanting to put into practice. Give it a good go, you know. And if you ever get the administrator saying, but why are you doing it in this way? You say, well, I've learned other things now. I'm going to give this a shot. There's a survey from this workshop as well. So I'm going to share that with you as well. And my email's there again for you. And I have a WordPress site where I share some of my ideas about literacy as well, if you ever want to go to it and have a look and listen to some more of my rants. I'm just going to share the survey link first. The survey takes about 3 minutes again. It's very short. I really value your feedback if you want to share anything about the workshop tonight. And I'm also going to share with you Tessa's website link, because I think that is a really useful strategy for spelling. And if you want to see, so this is the link that she has that shows some of her primary spelling strategies. But you will get a copy of these links as well in a follow-up email from Robin. Okay, we still have a few more minutes if anyone had any other questions, text questions. Oh yeah, I'll share. That's lovely. I'll share my WordPress site link. Feel free to give it a follow. I mean, what I talk about is really blabbing on about stuff. I talk a little bit about functional grammar as well. That's my usual jam, but I do love literacy. If you have any questions about anything though, feel free to contact me. I do love talking literacy and talking teaching. So that's it for tonight. If you don't have any more questions, I'll let you go and enjoy your evenings. Okay, would I have any resources on how to choose quality text for primary schools? What are the features of a good text? Well, I would firstly suggest to go and have a look at the Children's Book Council of Australia. For me, a good text is something that when you pick it up, you enjoy reading it. That's the first thing. Okay? So as a teacher, if you pick up that text and you go, oh, this is a drag to read, don't share it with your kids. If I pick up a text though, and I haven't chosen it from Children's Book Council Australia, I haven't looked through award winners or any of the authors there, and I open it up and I think, oh, I really enjoy the style this is written in, or it's in this really fun rhythm, it's got a great plot line. You know, for me, that's some of those take-home messages. But yes, look at your award winners first. Look at some of the stuff on Reading Australia. Talk to librarians. Like, librarians love talking books. Even if you've got a local library near you and you say to those librarians, can you tell me like what's new in junior fiction, or what's up and coming? We've got some great libraries around us in ACT, so I love to go down to my local library and have a look at what's out on the shelves as well, because often those public libraries can be a great place to start if you don't have a librarian on your school campus. Thanks everyone. Oh, you're all so lovely. Thanks for a fantastic evening and a wonderful workshop. I've had a lot of fun. I hope you guys have as well. If there are no other chats or no other questions, I'll let you go. Okay, bye.